Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question, a big one really. Why do opposition movements fail against leaders like Hitler and Castro? We've got a history podcast to dissect today, so let's get into it.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, how two different regimes, different times, different places, even what they said they believed in. It's interesting how similar their tactics were to silence opposition. But before we get into those connections, maybe we should set the scene a little bit for both.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. It's like we're playing detective or something. So this podcast, it's comparing Germany and Cuba, pulling out those shared tactics. Kind of like a manual for repression. It's scary stuff.
It is, but that's why we're here.
Right, exactly. Okay, so first up, Hitler's Germany. This podcast, it paints a really stark picture of Germany between the wars. Economic ruin, 6 million unemployed by 33. I mean, talk about an open door for a guy like Hitler, right? Someone who's going to make a lot of promises.
Yep. And promise he did. It's incredible how effectively Hitler used that desperation. Public works, rearmament. Those weren't just words in a speech. They were things people could actually see, and people were desperate for something, anything to believe in.
And it's easy to forget, sitting here today, but for a lot of Germans, even ones who weren't totally sold on Nazis, Hitler looked like hope at the beginning.
Absolutely, but it's more complex than that, right? Yeah. The podcast really emphasizes the role of fear, too. The SS, the Gestapo, they weren't just, agencies. They were tools to terrify people, stop dissent before it even started.
Okay, yeah, and here's the really creepy part. Turning everyday people into spies. Neighbors reporting on each other, everyone's suspicious all the time. How do you organize any kind of resistance when you can't trust anyone?
Exactly. It's psychological warfare, that constant threat. It's not just the violence, but the threat of it. That's how you break down trust, turn communities into surveillance networks.
And it wasn't like the opposition was all that organized anyway, right? You had the Social Democrats, the Communists. They hated Hitler, sure, but they weren't exactly best friends either.
Yeah, and a divided enemy is an easily conquered one. That's a lesson from history right there. And the podcast mentions some folks who did resist. Pastor Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the White Rose movement. Brave people, but they were outmatched because they were isolated.
So it wasn't just everyday people who were divided. Even those with strongly opposing views couldn't come together. But what about those in power? The elites. You'd think they'd see what was happening.
It's interesting. The podcast mentions that even elites, some military guys even, they didn't really think about actively opposing Hitler until 37 or later.
Oh, wow. So late in the game. Why? What changed?
Well, they were alarmed by how aggressive his foreign policy was becoming, like with Austria. They even used the German word Anschluss, meaning connection or joining. Makes it sound friendlier than it was, huh? But anyway, point is, by that time, Hitler had racked up enough wins to make resistance feel like a losing battle.
So it's like all these things came together at once, a perfect storm. You've got the economy in shambles, fear everywhere, no one trusting each other, and Hitler using all of that to his advantage.
Exactly. A very dangerous combination.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now let's switch gears to Castro's Cuba. This is where things get really interesting, because even though we see some of those same tactics, the Cuban Revolution, it started very differently. It wasn't just some power grab, right? I mean, Castro took down Batista in '59, and people were into it, especially folks who were struggling before. There's this law, the 1959 Agrarian Reform Law. He basically took land from the wealthy and gave it to peasants.
Absolutely. Castro, he knew that real power needs more than just fear. People have to feel like the leader is on their side. You know what I mean? He had to deliver on those revolutionary promises, at least at first.
And he did.
Yeah.
At first. But kind of like we were talking about with Germany, that doesn't last forever.
Right. You can't keep a revolution going without eventually resorting to some, let's say, less than democratic methods. The podcast really digs into that.
And it's scary stuff. I mean, Castro, just like Hitler, knew to really stay in charge. He needed to control what people heard, what they thought, and he found some pretty sneaky ways to do that.
Sneaky is a good word for it. The podcast talks about these committees for the defense of the revolution. They call them CDRs. Get this, by 1961, there were 800,000 of them. Your neighbors aren't just watching you, they're expected to report anything at all that seems like criticism of Castro.
Wow, 800,000, that's insane. So it's not even like secret police anymore. It's like everyone's part of it.
Right. And imagine living with that every day. You can't trust anyone, not even your own family, because you never know who might be listening or what they might misinterpret.
Yeah, you're afraid to even say what you really think, even in your own home.
Exactly. So it's fear, but it's this insidious kind of fear, the kind that seeps into every corner of your life. It's very effective.
So much more subtle than the Nazis, but maybe even more pervasive?
Maybe so. And there's another interesting difference the podcast brings up. See, instead of just rounding up opponents, imprisoning them, Castro often encouraged them to just leave Cuba altogether.
Oh, wow. So it's like get out and stay out.
Exactly. The podcast mentions this thing called the Mariel boat lift happened back in 1980. Over 125,000 Cubans fled to the U.S. Imagine that all that opposition gone.
It's like he found a way to just get rid of anyone who disagreed with him without even having to lock them up.
In a way, yes. Very clever, but ruthless.
Totally. So he gets rid of a lot of potential opposition, but what about the folks who stay? The ones who don't want to leave Cuba, even though they disagree with Castro? What happens to them?
That's where ideology comes into play. We talked about how Hitler twisted the idea of nationalism, right? Well, Castro did something similar with Marxist-Leninism. In his version of things, anyone who questioned him, who opposed him in any way, wasn't just wrong, they were counter-revolutionaries, enemies of the people.
So you couldn't just disagree with a policy, you were automatically a traitor.
Essentially, yes. And it worked brilliantly, especially with the Cold War going on. Anyone who spoke out against Castro could be painted as a puppet of the U.S., a threat to the revolution.
Talk about a way to silence people. You make it dangerous to even question anything.
And that's the point, isn't it? Control the narrative, control the people. It's a tactic as old as time, but Castro used it masterfully.
Okay, so we've got Germany, economically devastated, and Cuba swept up in this whole revolutionary fervor. And both end up under the thumb of these dictators. But even with those very different beginnings, this podcast says there's a lot in common in how those dictators kept their power, right?
You got it. The podcast does a good job of highlighting the parallels, even though these two guys, these regimes, seem so different on the surface.
So it's not enough to just look back and say, wow, those dictators were bad dudes, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to actually learn from this because these tactics, they're still around.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing. They're not always as obvious as, tanks in the streets. It often starts small. A leader promising things that are impossible, turning people against each other, controlling the information so tightly that anyone who disagrees is like the enemy.
Okay, that does sound kind of familiar, actually. So how do we recognize that early on? What should we be watching out for based on what we've learned from all this history?
Well, you mentioned the economy earlier. The podcast really hammers home how important the economy is, how much economic hardship can lead to this kind of toxic leadership.
Yeah, people get desperate. They'll turn to anyone who promises to fix things, even if it means turning on each other or giving up their freedoms.
Right, exactly. So that's one thing to watch for. Growing inequality, people struggling while a select few are doing better than ever. That's a big red flag.
Okay, so economic trouble for sure. What else? What other signs should set off alarm bells for us?
Division. This is huge. Both Hitler and Castro, they were so good at exploiting divisions that already existed in their countries. Political differences, social differences, anything they could use.
Divide and conquer, right? Classic tactic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A country divided against itself, that's an easy target for someone who wants absolute power.
So basically, any leader, any policy, any kind of rhetoric that's all about creating division, pitting one group against another, that's a huge warning sign.
Absolutely. We can't let ourselves be manipulated like that. And maybe the most important takeaway from all of this, the thing that really ties it all together, protecting freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Once those are gone, once people are afraid to speak their minds, that's when things get really dangerous.
Yeah, because then there's no holding those in power accountable. Okay, so to sum up our deep dive today, watch out for leaders who use fear and division, be wary of anyone with easy answers to complicated problems, and never ever take our freedoms for granted. It's heavy stuff, but it's important to talk about.
You said it. Someone once said that those who can't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. So by understanding how these dictators came to power, what tactics they used, maybe, just maybe, we can prevent it from happening again.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah.
We've gone from Nazi Germany to Castro's Cuba, and it all comes back to this. How do we stop tyranny? There's no simple answer, but this deep dive has definitely given us a better understanding of how it happens, how to recognize the warning signs, and most importantly, how to resist. So keep learning, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.